disrupted them all. So I apologize for that, but the worst part is now you got to look at me, because I'm going to do this without the slides, which is not that big of a deal. And the other thing was, I always make a disclaimer too, I did a lot of research from police reports, arrest reports, court records, and actual newspapers from back in the day. You know, there's different sites on the computer, you can access older newspapers. So all the facts in the book are real. And although I do intense research for all my books, I did not go to any brothels. Just want to let you know that, because I'm too cheap. So I didn't go to any brothels, but there are interesting stories about some madams. The one was in Otisville, and there's a few other chapters in there about that. First of all, I'd like to start off by, you know, the sites in this book, and there's 42, I believe, in all. They go from Westchester and Rockland all the way up to Greene and Columbia. Anybody want to take a guess on what municipality in that whole Hudson Valley area got the nickname the Weekend Vice Resort? This is a true story. One city, town, or whatever municipality.
Albany?
No, that's pretty close. Well, that would be the Capital District, though. I wouldn't have included that.
Oh, how about Newburgh?
You know, everybody says Newburgh. Makes me not want to buy a house in Newburgh. No, it actually was Hudson, New York. Hudson, New York. And I'll tell you how this all came about. During the late 19th century, Britain's Royal Navy really clamped down on the whaling industry in this country. They were intercepting ships, and so they were based in Nantucket, Massachusetts at the time, and they had to abandon that site, and of all places, they relocated to Hudson, which is 100 miles away from the ocean. But the industry thrived there for decades. They really did wonderful there. Now, that being said, sailors that were confined to those whaling ships for weeks on end or months on end, they had three basic needs when they got into Hudson. Woman, alcohol, and gambling. And from 1890 to 1950, Hudson gladly provided all those services. And why it got the title Weekend Vice Resort is, as you're probably aware, it's not that far from Hudson to Albany. And our esteemed politicians that we put in office used to come down on Friday, Saturday, and Sunday and avail themselves of the same services. Now, the city experienced its first big raid in 1922 when the City Safety Commission hired private investigators during Prohibition because there were so many speakeasies in Hudson, New York. The reason that the Safety Commission got involved is that the chief of police, the mayor, and the district attorney were all on the payrolls of the speakeasies. So they weren't really going to do anything about it. So they hired private investigators, because when you went into a speakeasy, it wasn't like going into a bar today with all the alcohol behind. It was under the counter. And, you know, the private investigator would come in, and if they reached under the counter and gave them whiskey or whatever, they would report back to the Safety Commission. A glaring example of how corrupt the city was at that time, the leading speakeasy in Hudson was a one-story building at 330 Warren Street. If you're familiar with Hudson, that's the main drag. It was a one-story building, and often there was a line going down the alley for people waiting to get into that speakeasy. Well, right across the street, there was a three-story building. Today it's called the Hudson Opera House. Back in those days, it was police headquarters. So they didn't even have to leave the building. All they had to do was look out the window, and they would see what was going on. Now, following the investigation and hearings, the police chief was demoted to a patrolman, The DA was fired, and the mayor just thought it was a good time to retire. He'd been around for a while. On June 24th, 1950, a bigger raid occurred, and that's because the governor, Thomas Dewey, had learned about the reputation of the lawless. It was like the Wild Wild West in Hudson. And so in 1950, on June 24th, he sent 55 state troopers from Albany. They swept into Hudson. There was no contact with the mayor, the chief of police, or anybody. They just came into town. And their first stop was Columbia Street. Now, for those of you not familiar with Hudson, Warren Street and Columbia Street run parallel. Columbia Street is 2 blocks north of Warren. And between 3rd and 4th Street on Columbia Street was known as the Block. And the reason it was known as the Block was there was 15 brothels and up to 75 ladies of the evening available at all times. So they went and they raided that first. In addition to the brothels, gambling dens set up behind legitimate businesses all along Warren Street were raided. You would go into a grocery store and pick up milk and bread, and you would see the screen line, and you figure, well, there's supplies back there. There were slot machines and gambling, card games going on. And so that's where, now, the non-enforcement in the city couldn't be more evident than when Sergeant William Egan and Patrolman Arthur Finch were caught in one of the brothels when it was raided. Now, following the investigation, it was discovered that during the last 5 years, the mayor, Earl Cowell, had spent $10,000 per year more than he made in his official salary. The trials for 4 madams, 24 gambling operators, and a number of city officials drew so much attention that there were trials in the morning, afternoon, and evening, and the courtroom was always packed. In the end, law was restored. The brothels that were along Columbia Street, there were 4 left, 4 buildings left. They didn't take them down because they were brothels. They put a big municipal parking lot on Columbia Street, and that's where a lot of them got knocked down. But there were still 4 there, and they were mandated to be sold as private residences, which they still are today. As far as Warren Street goes, it's very upscale now. It's all antique shops, art galleries, chic restaurants, and so law was definitely restored in Hudson after that 1950 raid. Let's go into mobsters. I was born and raised in Brooklyn. We knew the mobsters in Brooklyn. They wore really nice suits. One time I went home and I said to my mother, there must be a big wedding going on. I was young. I was young and naive. And she said, what are you talking about? I said, there's a lot of guys with really beautiful suits and carnations. She said, there's no wedding and stay away from them. The Gambinos ruled my neighborhood. I grew up in East New York, and that's where Gotti and all of them came from. So anyway, now I'm up here 40 years. I live up in the Hudson Valley now, and then I start researching this book, and I said, my God, I moved up here to give my kids a better life. I didn't realize these mobsters were up here. The first one was a Jewish mobster named Arthur Flegenheimer. We know him as Dutch Schultz. And Dutch Schultz operated in the Bronx, and he became one of the largest bootleg alcohol distributors in the Bronx. He tried to get his operation into Manhattan, but he made a bad choice by doing that because that was already controlled by 2 mobsters, very powerful. Irish mobster Legs Diamond, Italian mobster Lucky Luciano. And he made 2 lifetime enemies when he did that. As Schultz's operation continued to grow in the Bronx, he, of course, came to the attention of law enforcement. And when things got too hot in the Bronx, he got himself a safe house on 111 North Street in the city of Newburgh. So there we go. That house is still standing, by the way, at 111 North Street. It had the obligatory, this house was built in 1932, and its official owner was a mob associate, Dominic Petrilli. And 1932, it was in a middle-class neighborhood, but it had a tennis court and a built-in swimming pool in the backyard and a big wall so that you couldn't look into the yard. It also had a tunnel in the basement that went 2 blocks out towards Mount St. Mary's College, and it came out in what was then woods. There were no apartments there now. It came out in an apartment complex. That tunnel was cemented up in the woods on the way out, but I have to imagine that tunnel's still in there. And my late wife came with me on that trip. I was photographing some of the places for the book, and as we came around the corner, she saw the same thing that I saw in front of the house, and she started chanting like a Buddhist monk, no, 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 no. There was a Century 21 sign, and she read my mind. I wanted to go into Dutch, find Dutch Schultz's safe house. We're not moving to Newburgh. So it very interesting. And they had the obligatory white fountain, you know, in the front yard with all the Mobsters have to have a white fountain. Now, while he was in the Hudson Valley, Schultz established a very cunning underground bootleg distillery on what was purported to be a turkey farm up in Pine Plains, New York. It was called Harvest Homestead Farm. And there were trucks just coming in and out of this turkey farm every day. Well, the police in Pine Plains weren't stupid. And so they raided the farm. You know, first of all, it wasn't Thanksgiving. Where were all these turkeys going? You know, this is like August. So they raided the farm 7 times. They went into all the bunkhouses, the barns, they went into everything. And they didn't realize they were actually walking on top of the distillery. There was one foundation that I found when I went up there. I asked for permission because it's still privately owned. And it had a rectangle hole, and that's where the people would get into the distillery, the employees, to get down there. And that was covered by hedges and bushes, so the police never found it. They never found the entrance. Well, they got so frustrated, the Department of Justice sent in a team of federal agents. And one of the agents got behind the bush and saw this hole in the stone foundation, and they raided it, and all but two people got away because Dutch Schultz had escape hatches where they could run up into the woods in the back of the farm. Naturally, the 2 guys that got detained were Italians. Can I tell you? Musso, what are you going to do? So anyway, that was how that happened. Now, while staying in Newburgh, Schultz and his associates would visit a mob-controlled saloon a block and a half away from the safe house, and that place is still doing business as the North Plank Road Tavern. You familiar with that? Yes. That was all controlled by the mob. The first floor was a speakeasy, the second floor was gambling, slot machines, and the third floor was a very small distillery making Applejack. And I don't get any money or even a free meal for this, but it's a very good restaurant today. And the owner is very, very, I mean, you start talking to him, he'll be at your table for your whole meal. He loves the history of the building, and he's kept it as much as he could to look like it did back in those days. But he told me a story when I was researching it for the book, that he redid the kitchen. And when they pulled up the old planks in the kitchen, he found loaded guns and bottles of bootleg alcohol under the kitchen floor. So, and they'll tell you all about it if you go in there. Now, Schultz kept coming under intense pressure because the man I mentioned earlier, Thomas Dewey, at that time was the district attorney. He wasn't governor yet. And he was putting a lot of heat on Dutch Schultz. Well, Dutch Schultz had a bad temper, and so he approached the National Crime Syndicate to get permission to whack Dewey. You know what the National Crime Syndicate is? There's 5 families in New York. the godfather of each of the 5 families sat on this national crime syndicate, and they were like the Supreme Court of the mob. And if they said, well, what they did was they turned him down right away, because there was a long-standing rule with the mob that you don't go after a police officer or a politician, because you're just going to bring a bigger spotlight down on yourself. And so they turned him down. Notice I keep using the word mob, because I was born in Brooklyn, I'm 100% Sicilian, and there is no mafia. I used to tell people when they brought up the word mafia, I said, well, there's nothing wrong with it. It was the Mothers and Fathers Italian Association. Now, when the commission turned him down, Dutch Schultz was very stubborn, and he continued to plan the hit on Dewey. Well, it's not wise to ignore mob rules. And on October 23rd, 1935, he was with his associates in the back room of a restaurant in Newark, New Jersey, when a team of assassins came in, and they were all shot. And Dewey lingered until the next morning. And in fact, in doing the research, one of the last things he did was he requested a priest. He was a Jewish mobster, but he requested a priest. He found religion, and he wanted to convert and whatever. So I don't know how that worked out for him in the afterlife. But what really surprised me was when he died, he was only 34 years old. It's unbelievable how much these guys, they could have probably been CEOs if they went straight. The second mobster to come up in this area for similar reasons when things got hot down in Manhattan was a man named John Thomas Diamond, better known as Legs Diamond. And he got that nickname Legs because he had a great ability to hold up trucks transporting illegal alcohol and getting away before his fellow mobsters or the police could catch him. He always got away, and he had the luck of the Irish. I guess you could put it that way. Now, his safe house, if you're familiar with Highland, New York, when you get out of the village of Highland, you're on 4455. Heading west. And the hotel he took over, a few rooms in the hotel, was Freedman's Hotel, was the name of the hotel. Now, while hiding out in Highland, he also opened a bootleg distillery, but what he did was, that was hiding in plain sight, it was the old Barman's Brewery building in Kingston, and because Prohibition prohibited any kind of manufacture of alcohol, the building was vacant. Well, he got in there, set up his equipment, and he went to work. What he did was, the alcohol was manufactured in the brewery building, but it was siphoned into a warehouse 2 blocks away in Kingston. Now, how did he siphon it from the brewery building to the warehouse? It went through a pipeline of rubber hose that ran through Kingston's sewer system. I don't care how good alcohol is. I'm not drinking it if it's going through the sewer system. And the other thing is, I kept questioning, how in the world did Legs Diamond get this through the Kingston sewer system? And what I found out was there were a number of municipal employees in Kingston that had a financial windfall that year. So they put it through for him. The operation was very successful through June 1931, and again a team of federal agents came down, got into the brewery, and confiscated 1931 money, $1 million worth of material, equipment, and they shut the whole operation down. But Legs also distributed beer from farther north in Cairo, New York, Greene County. And that was said to be the largest shipments of alcohol to take care of the speakeasies in Albany. So he actually controlled all the speakeasies in Albany. During his time in the Hudson Valley, Legs Diamond survived several attempts on his life. And one that was very interesting to me, he had another safe house in Cairo when he was up there. He would every once in a while go up there to oversee his Albany operations. And a police officer, a local police officer in Cairo, was driving by his driveway, knew Legs Diamond, it was his safe house. There was a dirt road, there were hedges on both sides of the driveway, and he saw these metal pipes sticking out of the hedges. And he said, what in the world is that? So he called the state troopers, and the state troopers came down and they arrested 8 men. They were rifles sticking out of, they were looking to assassinate Lady Diamond when he came up his driveway. Fortunately, the luck of the Irish, he decided to spend that night in Lake George with his mistress, and it saved his life. And that's how he got away with that. Now, his luck also extended to several trials he went under for bootlegging, tax evasion, and kidnapping. He beat every case he ever went on. When he was incarcerated at the Greene County Jail, which at that time was in Catskill, New York, before he arrived, he was awaiting trial. They put extra bars on his window, and they invested in a lighting system with floodlights. They lit up the whole outside of the jail so that his associates couldn't help him escape. And I'm sure his other inmates loved having spotlights on all night when they tried to sleep. His luck ran out on December 17, 1931. He beat yet another trial in Troy, New York, and he was out in Albany, back in Albany, he's right next to Troy, and he was celebrating with his mob associates and the girlfriends and everything until 4:30 in the morning. 4:30 in the morning, he went back to his boarding house that he rented in Albany, 2nd floor, and he was exhausted, just flopped into bed. 1 hour later, 2 gunmen came in and they murdered him. Now, that case is still open. All these years later, the suspects were very long because he not only frustrated law enforcement, he frustrated his own the other mobsters that he was stealing from. The Albany Police Department was even considered likely to have committed that murder, and how that story got legs, no pun intended, how that story got legs was that 3 weeks after the murder, a sergeant on the Albany Police Department was promoted to chief of police. Was it payoff? I don't know. Now let's go back to Freedman's Hotel in Highland. In 1958, the Freedman family wanted to sell, they wanted to retire. And so the Turk family bought it in 1958, and they used that big wood frame hotel as their first facility for what we know as the Rocking Horse Ranch Resort. Now that building eventually burned down, nothing suspicious. You know, a lot of those wooden structures from the 19th century suffered fires. And that came down, but the Turk family was determined to keep the resort going, and so they built the facilities that are there today. But as you pass that gate that says Rocking Horse Ranch over the top, that's exactly where Freedman's Hotel was. So if you feel a funny vibe, it's probably Lay's. Probably Lay's. Understand, I don't know if I told this earlier, I'm giving you bullets from each chapter. It goes into much more depth, but we can't have dinner tonight, right, Bill? So I had to cut it and just give you bullets. The next one, we're going to go up to Kingston, and the chapter is titled The Bagman for Tammany Hall. And the bagman was a fellow named Everett P. Fowler. He was an astute Kingston attorney, a politician, and the state's first deputy fire marshal. He was the son of Charles Fowler, who was also an attorney and a state senator, and Everett learned the ropes early about political clout, and he associated himself very early on with Tammany Hall. The state's strong arm, Tammany Hall was the state's strong arm of the Democratic Party back in those days. It was the later association that would ultimately earn Fowler the dubious distinction of being called the bagman for Tammany Hall. But it was the same association that got him the appointment as deputy fire marshal for New York State, a position that was sought by many more qualified, but Tammany Hall was very powerful, and they get their people put in place. Acting in his role as New York City's representative in a condemnation proceeding arising from the construction of the Ashokan Dam, Fowler implied to the contractors that they made an acceptable donation to the Democratic Party for future campaigns, they would be held in good standing. it didn't matter that many of the contractors were Republican or independent or whatever else. Road contractors also faced Fowler's request for contributions, and they were kind of between a rock and a hard place because his friend in Kingston, a close friend, C. Gordon Reel, was New York State Superintendent of Highways. So they kind of had no choice but to give the contribution. In 1913, one contractor, Seneca P. Hall, was requested, he was a staunch Republican, and Fowler didn't care. He said he wanted a $230 donation to the Democratic Party, which was a lot of money in those days. And if he didn't give it, his $23,000 road contract would not be approved. So he had no choice. He gave the $230, but then he made a formal protest with the governor. And an investigation took place, and they actually charged Fowler with extortion. They proved all the different witnesses they had. And that trial later that year was called the Tammany Hall corruption trial. Well, he was definitely destined to go to jail, but many other politicians in the state kept approaching the governor to go easy on him. And he actually got out without even a day in jail, and he held 3 more political posts before he died. It was a very powerful outfit. Now, if that, you know, I wasn't really surprised with that because we know how politics, money, we know how that goes. It's, you know, it's the name of the game. This next chapter blew my mind, though, and it's called Politics and the Get Out of Jail Free Card. And this was down in Haverstraw, New York. And this fellow was named William Clary. He was known as Big Fellow by his political allies. And he was the town clerk in Haverstraw and also the local boss of the Democratic Party. He wielded a lot of political clout in Haverstraw. Now, he was a close friend of Fred Newman, who was the publisher of the Rockland County Messenger weekly newspaper. And as a result of their friendship, Cleary's daughter Anna and Fred Newman's son Eugene were childhood sweethearts. Everything was going good, but an incident that happened in 1906 changed everything. A tragic landslide due to excessive digging along the banks of the Hudson River by the town's thriving brick-making industry. You know, Haverstraw was known for brick-making. And if you drive down 9W today, you will still see all the brick-making factories right along the river. Well, it resulted in the deaths of 20 workers. While Cleary supported the industry, his friend Newman wrote many columns in his newspaper, articles in his newspaper, blaming the industry on the incident and blaming the incident on greed and negligence. Well, that caused a lot of friction between the two friends. The final fallout between the two of them is when Newman decided to change his allegiance from a Democratic-based newspaper to a Republican-based newspaper, and they were never going to be friends again. At that point, Cleary, who was very loud and very boisterous, demanded that his daughter Anna break off her relationship with Eugene Newman. In fact, he went so as far, she played piano, under the guise of expanding her musical knowledge, he sent her to Manhattan to study at a school in Manhattan and got her an apartment down there with the hope that the distance would make the relationship peter out. He didn't know that Eugene Newman already had an apartment in Manhattan. And the two lovebirds just kept seeing each other constantly. Now, on July 1914, when word reached Haverstraw that Anna was pregnant, to say that Cleary's temper was explosive would be an understatement. For the couple's part, they immediately took a train to Hoboken, New Jersey and got married at the courthouse. And then Eugene Newman wanted to do right by his wife, put the marriage certificate in his suit pocket, took a train up to Haverstraw. He first went to her house to show the marriage certificate for her mother. Now, her mother wasn't thrilled over this whole thing, but at least she saw that they were doing the right thing. And she encouraged him to go see her husband in the town hall. Well, he wasn't looking forward to that, but he was destined, he was going to do it. When he arrived at Cleary's office in town hall, he might have found solace in the fact that 3 other men were standing in Cleary's office, so at least he wouldn't be alone with him. Those 3 men were Town Supervisor Joseph Feller, the Fire Chief Bernard Fox, and there was actually a Haverstraw policeman, Hugh Sheridan, standing in the office. But the minute Eugene Newman walked in the doorway, he didn't even have a chance to pull the marriage certificate out. Cleary looked at him, took a loaded gun off his desk, and murdered him right in the doorway. Bernard Fox ran over and grabbed the loaded gun from him. Cleary jumped up, ran down the hall to the DA's office. His name was Thomas Gagnon, and to confess his crime. But the problem that the DA, Thomas Gagnon, and the 3 men that witnessed the murder in his office, the problem they all had was that Cleary got every one of them their jobs. And it was like a hot potato. Nobody wanted to arrest them, not even the patrolman that was there. Next, Cleary went to the sheriff in town to get, to confess his crime, and he refused to arrest him without commitment papers signed by a judge. We call those a warrant for arrest today. So he went to a newly appointed judge's house to get the commitment papers signed, and the judge declined signing because he wasn't sworn in yet officially. No one wanted to touch this case at all. He finally got the necessary papers when he went down to New City, New York, and he got it from the county DA, and he was arrested by the county sheriff, Larry Severn. But Larry Severn did a very interesting thing. Right after he locked Cleary up in the prison down in New City, he went out to his desk and he made a personal phone call to Frank Kaminsky, who was a renowned criminal attorney with close ties to Tammany Hall, requesting that he represent the man he just locked up in jail. I don't know too many times that that's happened. The subsequent trial was a joke from beginning to end. Gagnon allowed the jury to be stacked with all of Cleary's supporters. When the defense came up with a temporary insanity plea, they put witnesses on the stand. Gagnon didn't put one witness to counter them at all. In the end, the jury acquitted Cleary of murder, and in an act of real arrogance, he got up from the defense table, went over to the jury and shook each of their hands, one by one, thanking them for a fair verdict. By this time, Fred Newman, the father, was too ill to attend the court. He eventually moved out of Haverstraw, and he died 3 years later, penniless. He used his last dollars trying to get his son justice with no luck. Now, as far as Cleary goes, that wasn't the end of his drama, because a few months after that trial, he was charged with financial malfeasance of town funds, and they had all the paperwork. He knew he was dead to rights. He was stealing money from the town. Well, he fled. He became a fugitive from justice, and law enforcement tracked him through Bermuda, Cuba, and California before finally capturing him in Washington, D.C. There must have been some haul that he took from the town to travel all those places. This time, Tammany Hall abandoned him. They had had enough of his nonsense, and he was convicted and sent to Sing Sing prison for 2.5 years. Forget about the murder. He got 2.5 years. Ironically, and this is another funny part, well, it's not funny, but to me it's, ironically, when Cleary fled Haverstraw, Tammany Hall was able to get his brother Ambrose Cleary to replace him as town clerk. When he got out of jail, he relocated to Brooklyn, where he lived his life out as a tailor, which was his profession before he got into politics. His wife, his daughter, never spoke to him again, and he never met his grandchild, and maybe that was the greatest punishment he could have had, and he just lived a very lonely life. And no, I never went to his tailor shop in Brooklyn. Smart. Another chapter, it's called Canadian Liquor Falls from Sky. Shortly before dusk on March 15, 1922, a Curtiss biplane began to circle an area in Croton-on-Hudson, down in Westchester County, deciding either to land in the then rural surroundings or whatever. He was just coming up and down. Feet above a farmhouse, he suddenly pulled up and the plane just started going straight up. But when he did that, a car that was parked alongside the road started flicking its lights on and off as if to signal him, hey, we're here. Well, he went to reverse course and bring it down, and unfortunately he pulled it too hard and ended up crashing the plane into the middle of a farm. The farm was owned by the former county sheriff, George McCall, who observed the plane going down and called the state troopers in White Plains. When he ran out to the scene of the crash, he said he saw a heavyweight man limping badly, jumping into this car and speeding on its way. When he went back to where the plane was, as you would imagine, when a plane goes down, you're going to smell gasoline or whatever. Well, he smelled something else, and he couldn't figure out until he got real close. The cockpit behind the pilot was filled with burlap sacks, and some of them had spilled on the ground, and there were broken bottles, and all of them had the stamp of the Quebec Liquor Commission on them. So this was Canadian liquor. There was no prohibition in Canada, and they were flying it down here. And our first thought was that the illegal alcohol was destined for the nearby Trumbull Inn, which was a speakeasy in Croton, because they had been raided 2 weeks earlier and they had no alcohol to serve their patients. And they went on that theory. These pilots were called rum runners, and it was a new way of bringing alcohol into the United States from Canada, because by that time they were intercepting the trucks at the border. Now, was it worth doing that? Well, if the alcohol, a bottle of alcohol was sold in Canada, they would get $3 for it. In the United States, they would get $15 for it. So in their mind, they figured this is well worth the effort, to bring it in. Now, the police confiscated all the liquor, obviously, and they canvassed all the hospitals in the area to see if the injured pilot went for medical attention, but they had no luck. But they were very happy that they intercepted this haul of liquor. Next chapter I'm going to talk about is called Music and Mobsters. I don't know if I ever did my music books here. I interviewed 100 recording artists from the 1950s and 1960s. For a book that I wrote called Setting the Record Straight, the Music and Careers of Recording Artists from the 50s and 60s. I interviewed Connie Francis, Chubby Checker, Brenda Lee, the Drifters, the Platters, the Coasters, all those groups from the 50s and 60s. And one of the people that I interviewed for that book was Jimmy Rogers. You might remember him for Honeycomb, Kisses Sweeter Than Wine. And he told me a story that when he came to New York, he was trying to get a recording contract, and he signed with Roulette Records. Little did he realize that the owner of Roulette Records, Morris Levy, a Jewish gangster, was associated with the Genovese crime family in New York. And they did not pay their royalties. They would not pay the royalties on records sold to the artists. Another fellow told me the story, a later artist, Tommy James and the Shondells. They said that he went into Morris Levy one day. They owed him about $10 million in royalties. They just wouldn't pay them royalties. They said, now go on the road, you make your money doing shows. Well, anyway, Jimmy Rogers was owed about $1 million, but we're talking the 1960. That was a lot of money. And Morris Levy basically threw him out of the office when he came in. He says, look, you got to pay me. He moved to California. He left Roulette Records. He signed with another label in California. And he was at a holiday party in December, driving home on a California road. When the car behind him started flashing its brights, he thought that it was his conductor who was spending the night at his house. So he pulled his car over to the side of the road, and he said, "Tony," I rolled the window down, looked up, and that's the last thing I remember. He was beaten with a lead pipe. His head, they left him hanging out of the car. They left him for dead. He didn't die, fortunately. However, he could never sing again. He spent 5 years learning how to walk again, how to talk. He really got a lot of brain damage and everything. And that was the mob's payoff for leaving Roulette Records. You don't walk out on him. In fact, Tommy James told me in later years, he's not in my book, but Tommy James, I was backstage, and I was talking to him about it, and he said that when he went in and told Morris Levy, "I want to get my royalty money," Morris Levy threatened him. He was a very, vulgar guy. And Tommy James said to him, "What are you going to do with Jimmy Rogers on me?" So I mean, it was kind of an unspoken secret that this went on. Well, anyway, having told you that story, I'm going to go into the music and mobsters chapter. During the mid-20th century, the mob kept tight control over the coin-operated amusement machine industry. Things like slot machines, remember the cigarette vending machines? You went in a restaurant or a tavern or something, and pinball machines. It was all controlled by the mob. While mobsters oversaw a number of music publishing companies and record companies like Roulette Records, the invention of the jukebox opened a whole new stream of revenue for the mobsters. By approaching a tavern or a restaurant owner and making them an offer that they couldn't refuse, in other words, "You're going to put my machines in your business," they had a regular stream of revenue coming in every week. By the 1950s, the mid-1950s, mob-controlled jukeboxes could be found in every ice cream parlor, and I'm sure you all remember going into a diner and having those tabletop. I went in with a roll of 3 songs for a quarter. I used to have a big wad of quarters in my pocket. Now, in 1958, Local 445 of the Teamsters Union was formed just to oversee jukebox operations in the Hudson Valley here. That was their whole job. The union secretary was a man named Theodore Daly, and he vowed to abolish control of jukeboxes, and he was called to testify at several trials against questionable characters. In 1961, he was testifying against notorious mobster Crazy Joe Gallo. I'm sure you know that name. And he was crazy because as soon as Daly took the stand, Joe Gallo jumped up at the defense table and said, "If you say one word against me, I'll murder you." Well, that motivated the judge to withdraw his bail. So Joe Gallo had to spend the rest of the trial in jail. Daly's appearance resulted in the conviction of 6 mobsters. Prior to the establishment of Local 445, there was another local called 266, but that was a big scam because the only people that were members of that local were the tavern and restaurant owners that were forced to have the machines. Now they had to pay monthly dues to the union. So it was all a big money scam. Now, if a business owner resisted, of course, they faced a strike line being set up outside their business. But worse, there was always the underlying threat of violence. It became known as the jukebox racket that led to a congressional hearing in Washington, D.C. But what happened was when one proprietor was called on the stand to testify, and the person that forced him was sitting right in front of him with his lawyer, the proprietor had sudden amnesia and couldn't remember what the guy looked like. In the end, the politicians abolished Local 266, and Local 445 continued to overlook everything in the Hudson Valley here. But you have to know, if you went into Goshen, you went into Highland, you went into Poughkeepsie, there was a mom and pop business, they were still getting their things put in there because they weren't likely to call the police out of fear. So that still went on and on for years to come. Ready to go to Goshen? This is one of two chapters in Goshen. Canadian brothel recruits thwarted. On October 15th, and I could not believe this went back this far with this trafficking nonsense. On October 15th, 1879, police in Goshen received an urgent telegram from their counterparts in Toronto, Canada, police department up there, requesting their assistance in detaining two teenage girls that were headed their way. They were going to arrive 8:30 that night in Middletown on the Erie Railroad line. They were reported to be accompanied by an older woman who was suspected of supplying girls to brothels in New York City. While given a full description of the two girls, two patrolmen from the Goshen Police Department went out to the Erie train station, shared the description with the conductor who knew exactly who they were talking about, and took them right over to the girls. Unfortunately, the older woman wasn't on the train, and they couldn't figure out what was going on, but they took the girls off the train kicking and screaming. They did not want to get off the train. When questioned at the police station in Goshen, the girls gave their names as Minnie Moran and Maud Miller. And the police figured out pretty fast they were fictitious names. Both girls claimed to have left their homes willingly because they felt the rules enforced by their families were cruel and strict. They should have grown up in my house. They weren't all cruel and strict. While they left willingly, they admitted that a woman unknown to them bought them both tickets to Manhattan, and she only stayed on the Erie train until they came into the United States in Buffalo. In Buffalo, she got off the train and told the girls to continue on their way. So police checked all the schedules, and what they assumed was the woman got off the Erie train not to be caught with the girls, which she would have definitely been caught in Middletown. And she got on a New York Central train that was scheduled to get to Grand Central Station at that time, 30 minutes before the girls' train on the Erie line. And then she could intercept the girls and bring them to the brothels. By the way, both girls were 13 years old at the time. Goshen police contacted the Toronto authorities, told them they had the girls in their police headquarters, and they were advised the police keep them there until a family member could come down. And that happened 3 days later when Mrs. Rogers came down, and she was the mother of one of the two girls. And she explained to the police that this all started because 3 years earlier her older daughter left Toronto and was working in a brothel in New York City and sending letters encouraging her younger sister to join her. You know, and that's how this whole thing started. The girls eventually returned to Toronto with Mrs. Rogers, and the attempt to recruit them to work in brothels was thankfully taken care of. It was one of many attempts in those days to lure young girls to the bright lights of New York City. And while the police were not happy that they didn't get the older woman, they certainly were happy that they prevented these two girls from ruining the rest of their lives. Okay, the next one, we're going to be in Wallkill, close by. And this chapter, anybody ever see the movie The Postman Rings Twice?
Yes.
Well, I added a little something. This chapter is called The Postman Rings Shoots Twice. For those of you that don't know, although I did write for the Poughkeepsie Journal as a columnist for 25 years, my regular job, for 38 years, I was a writer, editor of a monthly magazine, and a media spokesperson for postal headquarters. When I became a media spokesperson, because I have a big mouth and they figured they'd get the most out of me, it was right at the same time that expression going postal. And I had to constantly battle reporters. You know, they were faxing us reports from Washington every morning. This company, this big company, has a much worse record of violence than the post office. And we'd have to tell the reporters this all the time, and I just got tired of it after a while. But when I was researching this chapter, you have to know I had a little grin on my face. When the McHugh brothers both displayed affections for the Wallkill telephone operator named, I hope I get this right again, my Brooklynese gets involved with these names, Marie Terwillinger. Terwillinger, I got it right. Okay. And she favored the younger brother. Things were not going to end peacefully. The older brother was Harry McHugh, and he was the postmaster of Wallkill. Marie was 17 years old, considered a looker, always had a beautiful smile on her face, and that caught the attention of the postmaster, whose office was right downstairs from Marie's apartment on the second floor of the building. Now, tension grew quickly between you, the postmaster, who was 31 years old, and his younger brother, Jesse, 25, when Marie favored Jesse. And then, when Jesse borrowed $300 from his brother to what he said was settled personal matters, and the postmaster found out 2 weeks later he bought an engagement ring with the $300, things really heated up between them. Now, just before noon on March 27, 1928, the postmaster left his office and walked upstairs to speak with Marie. She was just getting ready to leave for work, and they were heard talking loudly in the hallway. Suddenly, 2 shots rang out. Marie came stumbling out of the building and fell onto the sidewalk. Following her was the postmaster, who came out of the door looking startled, like he was in shock of what just happened, still holding the gun in his hand. I should tell you, the gun was issued to the postmaster to protect the mail in his care. So it was a government-issued firearm. Don't worry about it, they don't issue guns to postmasters anymore, so if you need stamps this week, you're not going to get shot if you go in there. McHugh followed her from the hallway, and apparently in shock, he ran from the scene of the crime. Now, there were a few people that were gathered around Marie when his younger brother Jesse was coming up the street. He didn't even look that way. Went into the post office because he was the lunch relief clerk. Now, in the middle of the chaos, the sheriff arrived, someone who called the sheriff, and he interrogated Jesse and found out about the friction between the 2 brothers. Harry McHugh eluded police following the shooting, and the search was launched throughout Wallkill. They even set explosives in the Wallkill River with the hope that if, due to a lost love, he was under so much distress he committed suicide, the body would come to the top with the explosives. No luck. McHugh evaded capture for 2 days when police found him hiding in the Dale lumber yard, which was only 200 feet from the post office and the scene of the crime. When police started approaching him, he lifted the same gun up and he pulled the trigger at the police, and fortunately for their sake, the chamber was empty. The police hesitated, started moving towards him again. He panicked, put the gun to his head, and it wasn't fortunate this time because there was a bullet in the thing, and he put a bullet into his head and died that evening. And the reason I brought this to do in a presentation was that down in the city where I grew up, now again, we had the Gambinos around. If you had a loan and you didn't repay it, or you had a gambling debt and you couldn't repay, yeah, there are a lot of bad things happen. You get a beating, you get shot, depending on the amount. Up here, I found that a lot of the murders that I researched were due to a lost love or a love interest. It's really crazy, but that's just, and the next chapter will bring that home. The title of the chapter is Inconvenient Husband Poisoned to Death. Can't make this one up. In 1851, the murder trial of the town of Dover, Dutchess County, 30-year-old Lucianne Hogue became a sensationalized case in tabloids all around the country. This was the easiest chapter for me to write. There were so many articles on it, pamphlets, everything. It was on July 1st that her husband Nelson, who was 45, became violently ill after eating his evening meal at the house after work. Now, Nelson experienced the same illness a couple of times over the past few weeks, but this one proved fatal, and he just died right at the table. Now, close friends of Nelson knew he was in good health, and they just considered foul play, and they suspected foul play and urged Mrs. Holt to request a post-mortem examination. She dismissed that and buried him on July 4th. Now, initial suspicion reached a new level when, following Nelson's burial, a farmhand on the property, William Somers, aged 20, continued to live in the house with Mrs. Holt and her 5 children. 2 months later, she decides to sell the farm and move to Bridgeport, Connecticut, and William Somers follows her to Bridgeport, Connecticut. At that point, the Dover coroner, who was a friend of Nelson Holt, ordered the body exhumed, and the local physician, it didn't take him long to discover poison in the stomach. Based on the findings, warrants for the arrest of Lucianne Hogue and William Somers were issued. Dutchess County Sheriff Alonzo Maury traveled to Bridgeport and, arriving at daybreak, found the couple sharing a bed. He arrested them and transported them back to jail in Dutchess County. An investigation discovered that sometime before Nelson started feeling ill, witnesses placed Lucianne Hogue in the local general store buying a supply of arsenic. They also had another store in New Milford, Connecticut, and witnesses in that store placed her there buying another supply of arsenic. So she was dead to rights. Lucianne Hogue went on trial at the Dutchess County Courthouse March 18, 1952. She was found guilty and sentenced to death by hanging, but she received a stay of execution because it was found that she was carrying her 6th child. Was it Nelson's or was it Billy Boy's? We'll never know. Despite a plea for clemency from New York Governor Washington Hunt, her hanging was finally scheduled to occur July 30th, 1952, and at 11:45, they let her out from the courthouse there was a courtyard in the original courthouse in Poughkeepsie, and that's where the hanging gallows were. And she professed her innocence right to the end. 2 months later, William Somers went on the trial as an accessory to murder in Carmel, New York, and he was acquitted. So, let me see how my timing is here. So that, basically, like I was saying, that's kind of a thumbnail sketch of about 9 of the 42 chapters in the book. Some of them include Otisville. There was a big brothel operation out in Otisville. There's some stories in there from Middletown, local areas. But again, it goes from Westchester, Rockland, all the way up to Greene and Columbia. But I'd like to take any questions if you have any. Yes?
Doug Schultz.
Yes.
Is he the one that the legend is he buried his treasure?
I was getting, when this book first came out, I was getting some good publicity and everything, and I got an email from a fellow that lives upstate. He was supposedly buried over $1 million in Phoenicia.
Oh.
This guy and his son, he said they were digging up Phoenicia along Route 28 for the last 15 years. This is in an email. And then, I was speaking, I guess somebody quoted me where I was talking about the house with the tunnel underneath the house. And he was encouraging me to buy the house because he thinks, come on, man. First of all, if the money was in Phoenicia, how do you know it's not underneath the cement of Route 28? It was all dirt roads in those days. But he said, it's got to be in that tunnel. You should buy that. Yeah, I said, okay, thanks. I'll keep writing books. I'm not going to hit the lotto. Yeah, but that's where it was supposed to be, Phoenicia. And he and his son, for 15 years, are digging up along the side of the road. I said, how ridiculous is that? But I didn't buy the house anyway. And the good, I'll get it. But the good part of I was trying to sell the house to my late wife, and I said, God, what a man cave. It's 2 blocks long. I'll go down there, you'll never see me. You'll have peace in your life.
Is there anything about a disappearance of a judge named, I believe, Crater or something?
Where was that? Manhattan?
That was Manhattan.
No, it wouldn't be in, no. Well, I'll tell you the truth, I'm working on my 11th book now. And because of the attention this book got a lot of attention. I've been doing a lot of lectures. I'm writing a book now. I found a cemetery, and believe it or not, it was a half a mile. It was my mother's last apartment after my father passed away. She was a half a block from this cemetery called St. John's in Middle Village, New York. Yeah.
Oh, that's a big cemetery.
Now, you see like, what was I going to say, Chingiganti. You see a couple of mobsters in this cemetery, a couple of This St. John's has 30 mafia members. There, I used the word. They have 30 from Giganti to Gambino to Gotti to Cofacci. I mean, I'm working on it now, so the names are kind of floating around my head. But I'm going to do a profile on every one of them that's in there. I already got pictures, public domain pictures of each of them. And I'm going to go down to the cemetery and photograph the gravestones and everything. And that's the book. So now I'm hooked on the mob.
Yeah.
So it's a popular subject. This is why The Sopranos was so popular. This is why Goodfellas was such a big movie.
When you were saying Walkill, did you mean the hamlet, the real Walkill, or the Middletown
The
Walkill?
village. Yeah, Walkill.
The real Walkill.
Yeah, the real Walkill.
Did you say anything about White Lake, where they would bury bodies, White Lake up in Sullivan County?
I didn't do Sullivan because that's considered the Catskills.
Oh.
But there were burial grounds that I did bring up. This is supposed to be a big burial ground in Fishkill, actually. Yeah. Yeah, if you go to the Duchess Mall, you hear people talking from under the parking lot.
What's the oldest tombstone you ever came across? Date-wise?
Of the mobsters, Dwyer. This guy Dwyer, David Dwyer, and he was like 1910, which is pretty early for the mob. You know. There are a couple of old ones in that cemetery, but his was, it was around 1910, something like that.
What about Diamond Jim Brady? What was his big thing? I thought he had a mistress or something in Bay Ridge and had this big mansion.
Oh, down in Brooklyn.
Down in Brooklyn.
Yeah, I didn't get into Brooklyn. I should know it because I come from Brooklyn.
Me too.
But like I said, I was Gambino territory. My cousin, true story, my cousin, Mother Anthony,
Yeah.
you know, you're an Italian family, we sit at a Thanksgiving dinner and somebody yell out Anthony, and 7 of us stood up. Everybody was Anthony. But Anthony Mignatello was my cousin's name. And when they were teenagers, he was like this with Gotti.
Oh.
Teenagers, not later
Yeah.
on. And my aunt was a single parent. The first husband was abusive and she got divorced. And so she's raising 2 sons by herself. And she got a phone call at 2 o'clock in the morning. She had to go pick him up and Gotti at the jail or whatever. And 2 weeks later, he was on a plane to go live with my other aunt, her sister, out in California, because they were always getting in trouble. In fact, she used to tell my aunt, who passed 5 years ago at 97 years old, she was out in Las Vegas, she moved to. But she told me that Johnny used to come up for macaroni and meatballs every Wednesday night. So they were very close friends. So who knows, my cousin could have been Anthony the Bull instead of Sammy the Bull.
Oh, God.
Yeah, I talked to him about it, and he always downplayed it. He said, we were just thugs. We were just thugs. He didn't really want to talk about it that much. So, any other questions? Yes?
A while back, somebody gave me an article, and they had written about New Street in Goshen, the Waldmans. it became the squirrel cage.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's right over here, isn't it?
Yeah.
That's in the book.
Oh, is it?
Yeah.
That's in the book. I gotta let me see. Give me the chapter of it. Let's see. Goshen Social Club repeatedly rated 65. It's page 65. Let's see what it says here. That's a picture of the building. It wouldn't have been in my presentation anyway. I took that picture for the book. It was called the Trotter and Pacer Club back in the day in Goshen. Let me see. I think I ended with what it's called now. It was renamed Maxwell Steakhouse. Then it went to another name change to the Squirrel Cage. Still doing business as the New Street Tavern. It's at 14 New Street. That's the second Goshen chapter. Thank you for bringing that up. I said earlier, there's 2 chapters on Goshen, but that's the other chapter that was really interesting to me.
Did I'm sorry I was late. Did
Yeah.
you do Newburgh before?
Oh, there's a lot of stories for Newburgh.
In this book?
Yeah, yeah. There's a story in Newburgh actually where, there's a story in Newburgh where a woman was found murdered behind, those stone farm walls?
Yes.
Yeah.
They found her along what's today Route 9W between Newburgh, 4 miles north of Newburgh. And she was so disfigured they couldn't figure out who she was. So they actually put her body on display for 12 hours at the courthouse in Newburgh. That's still standing. It's right across from the library. They put her on display, and a number of people said she kind of looks like this person who used to go to a club or something, or a bar, a tavern in Newburgh. And so they called her sister down. She lived near the Shawgunk Mountains. She came down, and she was so disfigured. She said, well, it could be her, it's the right height and this and that. And so they had a funeral for her. And this case became so popular that like over 500 people showed up at the funeral that didn't even know her. And they all marched over to the cemetery. She's buried there. And then when they're in the cemetery, the girl that they all had named showed up in the cemetery. And she wasn't at all too pleased that they were having a funeral for her. Yeah, that's another chapter in the book. And so they left the grave as unmarked. I couldn't get a grave because they don't know who it is. Wow. They lowered the woman in, but meanwhile the person that's saying it is standing right there, pretty upset that they were having a funeral for her. Yeah, but there were a couple. And people say to me too, did you ever hear of Big Nell in Newburgh? Big Nell, had the biggest brothel right down by the Hudson River and stuff. She's got 6 children and she's got a slew of grandchildren, and I just did not want to do it. I just didn't want to do it. Not when there's kids and I'm not here to do that. I don't want to be, especially when there's grandchildren that are in school and you don't want to do that. Another one I didn't do was in Rhinebeck. Anybody know Fat Tony Salerno? He always had a little stogie sticking out of his mouth and a fedora. And he had a 100-acre horse farm in Rhinebeck. And I went up there and photographed it. Everything looks the same. He has 2 stallions at the entrance to the driveway. And then I thought, you know what, you're smarter than this. Do some research. And I found out he's got a son named Rocco living in Red Hook, and he's got another child living in Rhinebeck, and I don't want anybody knocking on my door. So you wrote about my father, huh? I don't know if they're connected. You have to be smart when you come to this stuff. So,
Tony? Another family name, Colombo, which is a lot closer to home.
yes, Colombo. Oh, God, what are we talking? We're not talking Washington.
No, Blooming Grove.
Blooming Grove.
He lived right up the street from us when we lived in Blooming
Oh,
Grove.
really? Well, the son still lives there.
I know. And that's my story, is that our kids were going to school in Washingtonville, and I became a soccer coach.
Oh,
And we formed the first team, and some parents showed up, and this guy walked up to me and he said, "I'm interested." I was coaching the team. I'm interested in being assistant coach. I said, "Great, you know." And he introduced himself. He said, "I'm Joe Colombo."
Wow.
Son.
The son.
But my story is that this was the sweetest guy, personable,
Well, you know what?
well-mannered.
There's been a whole change of things.
Yeah.
You know, people don't believe this, but I can tell you, I grew up with them all. They only
It's
don't
only
get
business.
involved on a big
Right.
level. And I'll tell you what, the neighborhood was the safest neighborhood
Yes.
there was. No one dared come in there and do anything. My sister lived right around the corner, her first house. She lived right around the corner from the Bergen Fish and Hunt Club. That was Gotti's club. And she'd sit out on her little stoop. She didn't have a porch. She'd sit out on a little stoop with her 2 kids. They were very young. And not every day, but he'd come walking around in like a jogging outfit, talking to somebody like this, and there'd be 2 guys walking 10 feet behind him. And he'd always come over, you know, pat my nephew on the head, "How you doing? How's everything?" Blah, blah, you know, very polite. And I said, "You better get inside." I grew up with the Roaring Twenties with the cars coming around. Remember the Roaring Twenties TV show? The car rips around the block and they're shooting. I said, "You're all going to be on the street." No, they were. It was you know, if you were involved with them, you were at risk.
Yeah.
That's it. So,
But,
yes.
But Geraldine Ferraro, in connection with Newburgh in the book.
Geraldine Ferraro, the vice president candidate.
Right.
No, no. She's from our neighborhood. This is my partner, Ray. All right, now I gotta tell you the story. We went from the 1st to the 8th grade together. I took her to the 8th grade dance, and then we didn't see each other for 61 years. Her husband sadly passed 5 years ago. My wife passed 4 years ago. We had a chance meeting at someone's dinner at their house, and we've been together ever since. And people keep telling us that's a Hallmark movie, but I'm holding out because I want Brad Pitt to play it. I'm sorry, that's just the way it is. Yeah, well, her husband there was a little riff-raff with Geraldine Ferraro's husband. It wasn't her necessarily.
Father also.
The father too?
Zuccarlo.
What are you gonna do?
His last name was Zuccarlo.
Zuccarlo, yeah. Anybody else? Yes.
My cousin owned worked in a gas station in Brooklyn, and this nice little old man came in with his Cadillac and smoking a cigar, and he was talking to my cousin. Fortunately, my father was coming around the block. You know, we traveled just to give them the business
Right.
around the block, and it was Carlo Gambino. So my cousin had no idea who it was, and he was asking, "Oh, you could come and work for me?" And my father was very nice. He says, "My nephew is 18. He says his mother wants him to go home now. Otherwise, you
Well,
get it."
when I first got out of the Army in 1971, I always wanted to be a photographer. So I was doing wedding photography. And then suddenly, an Italian couple wanted me to do their 50th wedding anniversary. It was like a wedding in a catering hall. So of course I did. It was the same as doing a wedding. And I started getting more and more referrals. So I was doing most of my photography in Bensonhurst,
Okay.
which was a hotbed for the mob.
Yeah.
And one day I was delivering the albums and everything. You know, they wanted albums just like a wedding. And I went in the trunk of my car. There was a bakery on the corner. And I went in the trunk of my car and I got the album out. And I went to shut the thing and I turned this way. And he was sitting right in the window of the bakery with a little espresso cup. And he just went, and I went, I don't even think I got paid when I dropped the album off. I wanted out of there. But that's all he did. He looked at me and he went, and I probably, my eyes were this big, and I said, "Oh God, it's gone."
Yeah.
But he was,
His son-in-law was a urologist. Dr. Frank Sinatra was a urologist. And he was at the hospital that I worked in Brooklyn, the late Victory Memorial Hospital. and he was a urologist, and everybody was saying, gee, he'll never cheat on his wife, because he'll be dead in an hour.
Oh, yeah,
Oh.
no, you don't,
Yeah.
but they all had gumad.
Oh, I know. It was the guma that you took out on a Friday and your wife on a Saturday, yeah.
Oh, you knew?
Of course.
That's what they did.
Yes.
The gumada was Friday night, and then you take your wife Saturday night. I never did that. Put me on the spot here. All right, well, if you're interested in the books, like I said, there's 42 chapters, and it goes into a lot more detail. They're $20 each, but thank you very much for coming.